For decades, a question has followed the astronaut corps. Did the men who flew to orbit and to the moon see things they could not explain? The answer survives in their own voice transcripts, recorded line by line between the spacecraft and Houston. What stands out in those transcripts is not that trained pilots saw strange things in space. It is how quickly they worked out what those things actually were, often within the same conversation, reasoning their way from wonder to a plain explanation. The setting for nearly all of it is the same: low Earth orbit, or the long coast toward the moon, a spacecraft window, the curve of the planet, and outside, raw sunlight against absolute black, with no air to soften anything the eye catches. The earliest account comes from December 1965, aboard Gemini 7. Frank Borman reported a bogey, the era S-word for an unknown aircraft, alongside a debris field he placed at roughly 4 miles, made of hundreds of little particles. Jim Lovell saw a brilliant body against the black, covered in particles. Strip it to its parts. A point of light Borman called a bogey, a nearby field of small bright fragments, a distance the crew themselves flagged as a rough guess. Those are the claims on the record, and the word that keeps returning is particles. 7 years later, Apollo 17 was outbound to the moon. The transcript catches the command module, pilot describing a few very bright particles or fragments drifting past the window. A crewmate adds, "It looks like the 4th of July out of Ron's window." Their description is careful: jagged, angular fragments, tumbling slowly, flat and flake-like, some perhaps 6 inches across, twinkling as they turned. This was not a crew alarmed by a mystery. It was a crew cataloging exactly what was outside the glass. When Houston asked what the fragments were, the crew answered themselves. The pieces looked curved, as if shed from the side of the S-IVB, the spent third stage of their own rocket. Then, plainly ice chunks, possibly, or maybe paint coming off of it. A slow cloud of bright flecks turned in the sunlight against pure black, easy to mistake for something grander. But the crew had already named it in the same breath. Ice and paint, shedding from their own discarded rocket stage, lit up like the 4th of July. There is a reason ice can look like fire up there. With no atmosphere, nothing dims a tiny object, and direct sunlight makes a millimeter fleck blaze. Against empty black, with nothing to give it scale, the eye cannot tell a near speck from a distant ship. What the crew did next mattered. They photographed the field, 2 frames about a minute apart, and noted no relative motion between the fragments. That is the behavior of men gathering data on debris, not chasing an unknown across the sky. Then the transcript shifts. The command module pilot reported something different. "A bright object," he said, obviously rotating, because it was flashing. Far out in the distance, not a nearby fleck, but something physical, a long way off, catching the light and throwing it back. Houston's response was not to wonder, but to measure. They asked the crew to call up the guidance computer, fix the spacecraft's attitude, reference the object against the body axis, and mark it as it crossed the window, trying to pin its position like a navigation fix. Then came the detail that settled it. The object flashed twice, the crew said. A bright flash, then a dull one, in rhythm. And one of them named it on the tape, that is the side of the S-IVB, and then the engine bell. The flashing object was their own spent stage. The crew closed the loop themselves. They had been noticing it, one said, for about 24 hours. He had simply not put it together as the S-IVB, and had assumed it was just another particle out there. The mystery, and its answer sat in the same conversation. So the honest picture is this: a flashing point in the distance, and then what it actually was: a spent rocket stage tumbling end over end, throwing a bright flash off its body, and a dull one off its engine bell. The thing they tracked for a day was a piece of their own ship. All of it traces back to the page. The flashes, the rotation, the distance, the identification, are recorded in the crew's own words. The document does not invite invention. It already corrected itself, out loud, on the tape. Move ahead to 1973, and from a spacecraft to a space station. Skylab, a long-duration crew, had far more time to notice the strange. And their technical debriefing is candid about every odd thing they reported during the months they spent in orbit. First, the light flashes. All of them saw them, the crew said, most often at night, lying in the sleep restraints with their eyes closed. Spots, sunbursts, and streaks, 2 or 3 a minute, mostly at the edge of vision. Not an object outside, but something happening inside the eye. And they already suspected the cause. One crewman tied the flashes to the South Atlantic Anomaly, where Earth radiation belts dip low. Another described an entrance streak and an exit streak, like a particle crossing the eyeball. They're not a hallucination, the file insists. They were cosmic rays, striking the retina. Then the harder case. About a week before splashdown, the crew tracked a bright reddish object for 5 to 10 minutes. It rotated on a 10-second period, and held nearly fixed in the wardroom window. They judged it a satellite, in an orbit close to their own. Picture it as they described it. A steady reddish point, brighter than Jupiter, pulsing every 10 seconds, never resolving into a shape no matter how they watched. The crew's best read was another satellite. But, in their words, what satellite it was, no one ever explained to them. The word unidentified has to be handled with care. The crew's own judgment was that this was a satellite never cataloged back to them. A gap in the paperwork rather than a craft. Unidentified means not yet known. It does not mean already understood. And it does not mean a spaceship. The same debrief quietly explains the rest. Drifting points like thousands of stars were a propellant leak from the command module thrusters, freezing as it streamed. Other flashing lights they presumed were pieces of Skylab itself. Even the heat exchanger vanes, so coated with lint a crewman first took it for an anodized finish. Even faint glows that puzzled the instruments got plain answers. In the Apollo 17 science debrief, one ultraviolet signal was read as light from hot stars reflecting off interstellar dust, and another as sunlight scattering off hydrogen, drifting through the solar system. The reflex was always the same. Find the ordinary cause first. It is worth noting a quiet record too. The Apollo 12 transcript in this release is mostly rendezvous chatter. Battery charges, bus ties, switch settings, no bogey, no flashing object. A reminder that most of spaceflight is checklists, and that these files were not curated to thrill. Laid side by side, a pattern emerges. The particles were ice and paint. The flashing object was a rocket stage. The eye flashes were cosmic rays. The drifting lights were a thruster leak and station debris. The strange glows were dust and sunlight. One reddish object remains genuinely open. Each observation links to a cause the crew named. Except one. The reddish object to next to nothing resolved. Unidentified in this file and left that way. Where the evidence runs thin. The record says so, rather than filling the gap with a story. This is why the astronaut chapter matters. It is the cleanest test of the whole question. The best trained observers, the best documented sightings, and most of it dissolves under an honest reading. What survives is small, specific, and worth keeping open, so that is what the astronauts actually reported, and what it almost always was. Ice, paint, rocket stages, cosmic rays, a thruster leak, and one reddish point still waiting on a name. The record outlasts the legend, and the legend, it turns out, was mostly the record read carelessly.